All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to the show, and I hope you guys are all having a good time. All right. So, just a quick introduction. I'm Sanjay Joshi. I'm basically a hobbyist. I've been in this hobby for 30 years, and I've made every single mistake that ever anybody could ever make in this hobby. So, I've learned a lot from my mistakes, but I'm not going to talk about keeping a reef aquarium today. I'm going to talk about the fish in my reef aquariums. All right. So it's a topic that I don't usually talk about much, but I think I have a lot to say about fish. All right. So, how many of you here have 5 fish in your reef aquarium? 10? 20? 20? 30? 40? 50? Right? None of you. All right. Here's my aquarium at home. All right. I think the last time I counted, there was about 65 fish in there. All right. It's a 500-gallon aquarium. All right. So yes, I'm not saying you can put 60 fish in a 75-gallon tank, but it's a 500-gallon tank, and I like SPS corals. And one thing about SPS corals is that they don't move. So if you want any motion in the tank, it's going to come from the fish, right? So I like to put a lot of fish in my tanks because I like the motion, I like the colors, all right? And as you can see, I feed my fish a lot too, all right? So just to give you an idea of the fish that are in my tank right now, this is basically, I think it's a complete list because there are some fish in my tank that I don't even see. All right? So there's lots of different fish in here. I'm going to talk about the ones, some of these that I've kept, and give you a feel for their particular behaviors, and also give you some philosophy on my idea of keeping fish. Right? So when I first started in the hobby, I had a 29-gallon tank, right? There's only so many fish you can put in there, right? But if you want more fish in a small tank, go with small fish. That way you can put more fish in there, right? Don't put huge tanks in there, all right? Even if you see my big tank, I don't have many big fish because I want a lot of fish, so I stick to the smaller fish, right? That lets me get away with a lot of fish. Okay. The other thing you'll notice in my fish list and looking at the video, that I often have groups of the same fish. Right? I have 15 anthias in there. Right? I have multiple damsels. I have pairs of angelfish. All right? And so on. So I like to keep fish in either groups or pairs if I can, right? When I first started, on the left was my stocking philosophy on keeping fish, right? Just one fish of each type, one fish, one green fish, one red fish, whatever, and every fish was a single fish of its type, right? It had no company, right? So when I set up my 500-gallon tank, I changed my approach to keeping fish. I said, I want to keep fish that I can keep in groups. I want to keep fish that I can keep in pairs or trios, just like they would be in the wild, right? So that's kind of my thinking, right? And that's what I'll show you pictures of what I've done with these things, right? So some other tips on keeping fish, as I said earlier, the smaller the fish, the more you can have, right? So usually for me, if a fish is more than 4 inches, it's too big. Okay? It's too big. Although I do have a few that get big, but limited. Secondly, buy aquaculture fish. Right? So a lot of the fish that I try to keep, if I can get them aquacultured, that's what I'm going to do. All right? Partly because we want to stop collection from the wild. Right? So if we can find aquacultured fish, do it. I know they might cost a little bit more, but in the long run, they are healthier fish. They will live longer, and you won't have too many fish deaths and diseases. Right? My other strategy for getting fish is get juveniles. I don't want a full-blown adult terminal male wrasse, even though it looks spectacular, right? Because that fish is probably at the end of its life, right? So if you get juveniles, there's a good chance you're going to have that fish for a much longer period of time, right? And the nice benefit about that is also you see the fish grow, right? A lot of fish that we keep, the males and females are very different. But a lot of them start out as females and they switch to the male generation. So if you start with juveniles, you get to see that whole progression that the fish is going to go through, right? And I'll show you pictures of some of the different progressions that you can get, right? So my other goal was to keep the fish in groups and pairs. We talked about that. Quarantine, I'm going to talk a little bit about it later, okay? And then the other thing I've learned over the years with keeping fish is if you want the fish to be healthy and behave naturally, you need to give them a lot of hiding spaces. Right? Fish don't feel comfortable if they don't have a quote home. Right? I've noticed with my fish that every night when they go to sleep, they tend to sleep in the same place every night. Right? So they like having a home. It makes them more comfortable. And the more safe spaces you are, you can control the aggression among the fish. Because the fish always has a place to run away and hide. All right? My other philosophy with keeping fish is that I like to keep fish that occupy different regions in the aquarium. Right? Some fish like to stay low in the tank. They want to be near the sand, and they'll be picking in the sand. There are other fish that are free swimmers. There are some fish that like to be in the rocks and go in and out of the rocks, right? So the fish I keep, they pretty much occupy all the regions. I keep some cryptic fish that I don't even know if I have them or not because they stay hidden for so long. They hardly ever come out, not even to eat, right? But once in a while I'll see them, right? So I keep a range of fish that occupy different niches in my aquarium. Also, I like to keep fish that serve some utility in my tank. They have some purpose, right? If I keep tangs, I know they're going to feed on algae and keep the algae in control, right? If I keep filefish or butterfly fish, they'll help me control the aptasia, right? So they also have a useful purpose in the tank, right? So I like to look at that first. And then I go, well, if your purpose is only to look pretty in my tank, I'll still keep. But I'll give the edge to the fish that's more utility in my tank. Right? So I just walk through some of the fish that I've kept. All right. Tangs, everybody loves them. Right? They're very popular and great fish to keep. There's a huge number of different tangs that you can find out there. All right. These are some of the ones that I have kept in my tank. The blonde naso is one of my favorite tangs, in spite of the fact that it gets big. All right? So luckily, I got a naso tank that was already in my friend's tank, in a 75-gallon tank. That poor fish was already stunted. He had it for 5 years. He stunted it. It wasn't going to grow more. So I was like happy to take that one. Right? Because one of the things that happens is when you have a big tank, all your friends who have big fish that outgrew their tank, they want to give it to you. I told you, my philosophy is 4 inches is too big, for a fish. So, I still did take that blonde naso tang. The thing to remember with tangs is that they can live for a long time. Okay? Blonde naso just finally died in my tank about a month ago. All right? I've had it for 16 years. He had it for 5, right? And a few more years before that, for all we know, it was in the wild, right? So that's a 20-plus year span for a fish, right? So if you keep it healthy, give it the right conditions, they will live a long time, right? The hippo tank, same thing. When I set up my 500, I've got this hippo tank at 1 inch. That's all it was, right? I still have it today in that tank, right? So that's another 16 years that I've had it, right? So the problem with tanks is that they can be aggressive to each other, right? So you have to be careful with the mix of tanks that you create. Right? I love the Achilles tank. I have one in my tank right now. I think it's a beautiful fish, and I always wanted to keep it, right? But that fish is a fighter, okay? It'll slash other fish, okay? The Achilles tank also is more sensitive to flow. It loves a tank with a lot of flow, right? So because it comes from the surf zones, and they can withstand a lot of flow. I have an SPS coral tank. I have a ton of flow. And this tank will go right into the flow of an MP60 and pick off algae, right? So it can take a lot of flow. They actually like the flow, right? That's its game it plays, going into the flow, trying to reach the pump, and then lets loose and just gets pushed back, right? So that's its game. So these are the tanks. Again, I've had this Achilles for over 5 years now. I had another one before that lasted about 12 years. And then there's this class of the Zebrasoma species, right? All these tanks with a pointy nose. And again, very popular tanks. I love them, great. I have the purple tang, I have the yellow tang, I have a gem tang, okay? I've had the Scopas in the past. The problem with these, again, is I did put 2 yellows in my tank when I first set it up. They were juveniles, and again, they're still there in my tank. So this is another 20-year-old fish, right? Purple tank, same thing. It's been in my tank since I set it up, right? But the problem with these is I cannot add another tang in there without creating total chaos, okay? There is absolute war breaks out when I put another tang in there. So adding tangs to an established tank which already has tanks that have been there for so long is tricky, right? So you have to acclimatize the fish in a box, let the fish see each other, try to get some of that aggression out of there. And even then, when you release it after a week, there's still a lot of aggression, okay? And that's why the hiding places are important. If the fish can go and hide, it can protect itself from being constantly harassed and attacked, right? The other thing that I do if I'm going to add fish, I add multiple fish at one time, okay? So adding multiple fish at the same time tends to spread out some of the aggression, okay? Imagine having 10 tanks ganging up on you on one single fish, right? And these tanks can be really mean, right? So if I add tanks to my tank, I try to add at least 3 or 4 at one time, okay? Which I haven't added more tanks in a while. Okay? The others, I have a cold tang. Again, the cold tang has a very different mouth compared to the Zebrasomas and the other tangs. So it needs a different kind of algae, right? They're always scraping the rocks, right? So another useful fish and a pretty fish, right? And then, of course, the sailfin tang, very popular. Right? The only pair of tangs I have in my tank is the yellow tangs. Right? That's the only reason that there's 2 of them and they're hanging out and not killing each other off. Right? I got them, they were juveniles, and one of them turned into a male. Right? So that's the nice thing about fish, that they change sex. Okay? And most of the fish will go from juvenile to female and then female to male, except the clownfish. The clownfish will go from male to a female. All right? So if you want to create groups of fish, best strategy is get juveniles and let them sort their sexes out. Okay? Another favorite fish of mine is this whole group of pygmy angels. Right? And again, these are fish that a lot of people are skeptic about keeping in a reef tank because they're not reef safe. Well, reef safe to me is a very subjective term, right? It may not be safe in a 10-gallon tank with 2 corals in there, right? But they are perfectly fine in a 500-gallon tank with lots of corals to pick on. They never kill the corals, they just nip here and there and they move on. All right? So, fish that may not work in a small tank can work in a larger tank. Right? And again, this is my current, except for the tiger centropyge there, I have all of these in my tank right now. Right? So they'll coexist with others. Okay? There's the Sheppardi, there's the jockulators, the multibar, and then there's this golden pygmy angel. Right? That is a very, very cryptic fish. Okay? I have a pair of them. I don't see them at all. I don't see them at all. Once in a while, they'll pop out, and that's it. So, they're not cheap fish, but they're expensive, but they're always hidden. Right? Which is what I want. I want a fish that has cryptic, that hang around. Another very favorite fish of mine is these Genicanthus angelfish. Right? The picture on the left-hand side, maybe that's the Bellis angels. Sorry, that's the Watanabes. Right? And you can clearly see the difference between the male and the female. Right? The one at the bottom is the female, the one on top is the male. And it's not even a full-blown male because it's actually changing into a male. So the scribbles are kind of not correct yet. Right? I got 3 juveniles. They were about 1.5 inch when I got them. They were all females. I put them all 3 in there. And a few years later, the biggest one of them turned into a male. Right? And that's the transitioning male that you can see. And all those lines will straighten out eventually. Right? The same thing with the fish on the right. That is the Bellis angels. Right? And the Bellis, you can see the female and the male are very different in coloration. Right? The bottom one is the female and the top one is the male. Right? Again, same thing. I got a trio of these. I got 3 females. And eventually one of them turned into a male. Okay? The nice thing about having these fish in pairs is that they spawn in my tank every night. Every night they go through their spawning rituals. So that's something else, is the advantage of having fish in pairs and groups. Because you can see them spawning and see their full behaviors. Right? One of the problems with these fish, especially if you get them as adults, they're collected in deep waters. And when people bring them up, they pierce their swim bladder to get the air out. And sometimes then you get these fish, they don't swim right. Their swim bladder is not working properly and they have a very funny swimming motion, you know. So I prefer to get the juveniles. They're not collected in deeper waters, they're collected in shallower waters, and they come in clean, right? Yeah, and sometimes that change is very rapid. I had a trio of Bellis, and the male would spawn with both females every night. And then there was an accident in my tank, I lost one of the males. Within a week, right, one of the females switched to a male. Right? So those are the kind of the fun things that you can see when you start keeping fish in pairs and groups. Other angelfish that I've kept, the regal angel and the banded angels. Unfortunately, the banded angels are now almost impossible to get because they come from Hawaii and they've banned all the collection of these fish. Right? The regal angel, I had a pair of regal angels also. I had to take them out of my tank, right? because I came back from vacation once and they ate all my zoanthids. I had a huge collection of zoanthids. Right? So these fish have been with those zoanthids for several years and never touched them. Right? Came back from one long vacation. I guess they were hungry. Nobody was feeding them properly. And they had completely destroyed the population of my zoanthids. They left all the brown, ugly ones and ate all the good ones. All right, so I actually had to fish those, take them out of there. All right. So again, going back to what is reef safe? Right? If I didn't have the zoanthids, I didn't care about those zoanthids, this fish was perfectly fine. Right? So it's important to know what the fish might actually end up eating in your tank. All right? And the fish don't read the books. Okay? So I had a friend who had tangs in his tank, and his tangs would always eat the Trachyphilia he put in there. They would just destroy it. You know, they're not supposed to be eating that, right? So you never know what the fish is actually going to end up doing, right? So you have to be a little careful. And one of the things I always tell people is research the fish before you put it in, and before you put it in, have a plan to get it out of there. Okay? Because in a 500-gallon tank, getting a fish out is not easy at all. Okay? So, have a plan in case you have to take it out, whether it even be possible to take it out. Right? I'll never get those golden angels out because I don't even see them half the time. Right? I can get the tangs out because they come up like puppy dogs to feed. If I put up a trap in there, they go right into it after a while. Right? But those are not the fish I want to catch. Right? Another fish that's in my book is a useful fish, right? Butterfly fish. Reef safe or not, they'll eat aptasia, right? So these two fish are my best weapons for aptasia, right? People like the bristle-tailed filefish. That's an ugly fish, okay? If these fish can do the job, I'd rather keep these, right? So the one on the left is the marginalis butterfly, okay? They come from Australia, and they are a lot hardier than the copper bands. I don't have much luck with the copper band butterflies, okay? I don't care where I get them from, they don't last long. That marginalis I've had for 12 years. And now that fish will eat pellets, it eats everything, okay? And no aptasia in the tank, so he's done a great job of keeping the aptasia at bay, right? There's aptasia all over my sump, there's aptasia all over the overflows, but there's none in the tank, right? So it'll take care of those. Right? Damsels. Most people hate damsels. I don't know why, all right? I love damsels, but not all of them. I like the ones that stay small. These don't get bigger than 2 inches at the most, usually 1.5 inch, okay? The one on the left is the Roland's damsel. Again, they live for a long time. I threw 7 of them in my tank, all right? They each occupy little zones. They like to stay at the bottom, okay? And they have this habit that they like to lay eggs in caves. And they'll make their caves by sifting the sand and going under the rocks. So sometimes I'll come back and they've buried my corals at the bottom because they have moved the sand around to create a cave to lay the eggs. So these fish, they never swim openly in the water. They always stay towards the bottom, near the rocks, but they're very territorial, right? So with the 7 of them, they kind of space themselves out. You know, they all have their little regions where they have a pecking order. If something comes close to them, they'll fight it and chase the other one away, but they don't kill them, okay? And once in a while, you'll see 2 of them come out from under a rock, and you know there's eggs under the rock, okay? The Kupang damsel, I love that fish. Electric blue with the yellow. Unlike the Rolandis, these tend to stay in the middle of the water. Okay, so they'll swim around in the open water. So they don't really tussle with the Rolandis. The Rolandis stay at the bottom, these stay towards the top. Okay, and again, you can throw a bunch of them in there, and they'll just fight among themselves. It's like little kids squabbling all the time, but they're not really killing anybody or killing other fish either. Right? Some of the other small ones that I've kept, the Talbots. Talbot's a little milder than some of the other ones. The Springer Eye is a great fish. Okay, that's the blue one here. Okay. People claim that the Springer Eye will eat planaria. Okay. They haven't eaten that. I haven't seen them eat in my tanks. Okay. But it's possible they might do it. Right. So it's a useful fish too. Right. And again, it's better to keep several of these in the tank because then they can fight among each other and leave everybody else alone. Right? Grammas, another great fish. Right? I have a trio of the black caps in my tank. Right? I took 3 small ones and I put them in there, and one of them is growing huge, the other one's like medium size, the third one is still small. Right? The interesting fish, this fish likes to build a nest for itself. So I'll see the male actually carrying pieces of coral and rock and creating a little cave for himself. Okay, so that's a great fish. The Royal Gramma is a great fish. Again, you can keep them in groups. Okay, and they'll mate in your tanks and form. The one on the right is the Cuban basslet. It's more of a rare fish. It used to cost $3,000 at one time. I think now the prices are down to $600, but that is being tank raised. It's aquaculture now, right? But a very shy fish. When I first put it in the tank for the first month, I didn't even see it. Okay, didn't even see it. Then you see it once in a while, just dart out, grab something, and go back. You know, now it's bold enough that it comes out a lot more. All right. But that's not a fish that should belong in a 500-gallon tank. You should have it in the smaller tanks. Okay, 500-gallon tank, you spend $3,000, you don't even see the fish, right? Filefish. I have a pair of orange spot filefish in my tank, right? Again, most people will tell you never put that fish because they eat coral polyps. Okay, I have a pair of them. I haven't seen, they pick on the corals all the time, right? My SPS corals don't have any polyp extension because the fish are picking on them, which I don't care about. Right? It's fine. They're still growing and they're happy, right? So, but I love that, love those fish. Okay, so, and then there's the aptasia-eating filefish. If you want to get rid of aptasia with an ugly fish, that's your choice. Ugly and cheap, too. But the problem with this fish, again, is that once the aptasia are gone, it's going to eat other things. Okay? Mine started eating the zoanthids and started taking bites of my soft corals. The leather corals would have bites on them. Took me a while to figure out that it was the aptasia-eating filefish that was doing it. Okay? So you have to be careful with what the fish might do in a tank when it's not supposed to do it. Right? Anthias, it's another large family of fish that are very popular. Right? I've kept several different anthias over the years, but my favorite and the ones that behave the best and live the longest is the squamipennis anthias, the lyre tail, or the blue-eyed anthias. Okay? I kept dispars. I had like a school of 15 dispars. The females turned to males so quickly, and they would be the males. Once the 2 males in the tank, they're going to fight until one of them is dead. Okay, and the dispars, it was happening very fast. Within 9 months, I pretty much lost the whole school. With the squamipennis, I have 15 of them. I bought them all as females. One turned into a male. So the bottom picture there in the corner, that's the male. All right. It was a male for about 2 years. Nobody else changed. And then after 2 years, there was a switch. One of the senior females now turn into a male, right? And then there was a fight, right? And ultimately, the old male was chased away, put in a corner, and eventually he disappeared. Okay? But what it changed into was the one on the right, on the corner up there. Right? So it was a totally different looking male. So I did some research on it, and I found that oftentimes there's supposedly these other species of antheas that looks very similar to the squammy penis. They'll hang around with these. And probably that's what happened here. I ended up with a very different looking male, which might be the Cheiriopolis antheas. Okay. The other cool thing with antheas is that Midas blennies, which is the picture at the bottom there, they like to hang around with antheas. They have the same color as the females, okay? And they'll hang around with the antheas. So I put a couple of Midas blennies in there, and they just blend in with the school of antheas. That's how they are in the wild too. Okay? Other antheas that I've tried is the Randall's antheas. Didn't have much luck with them. That's the school of them that I got. They didn't last too long. All right. And then this one here is the Ventralis antheas. Okay. They usually have a very poor record of survival. Right? But they're really beautiful fish. Very shy. Right? So I actually set up a separate tank for these fish when I found that I could get a group of them. I got 5 of them. And they were all females, and then one of them turned into this male. But they would not be happy in my 500-gallon tank. There's too much of hustle bustle in that tank for them to be happy. Right? So for some fish, you almost may have to create a separate environment or give them the environment that they need to be happy. Right? And I've had this Ventralis now for 4 years, which is a long track record for these kind of fish. And then there's the group of wrasses. There's a whole bunch of beautiful fish that fall into this category. All right. These are some of the ones that I've kept. There's the redhead wrasse, not very commonly found. Okay. And I've never been able to find a female of that species. So that was just the male. Beautiful green with a red head. And there's the Femininus wrasse. All right. So the one on the top is the female Femininus, and the one on the bottom is the male. Right? So the females are way prettier than the male. Okay? So another one of those where I put 3 of these Femininus. Eventually one turned into a male, and then unfortunately he got so aggressive that he killed the other 2 females. Okay? And finally he jumped out of the tank. So that's a problem with wrasses. Okay? They are going to jump at some point. Right? So make sure your tank is always covered. Right? If they find the smallest hole, they're going to jump. They will jump. Right? Oops. The beautiful thing about wrasses, again, the males and the females tend to be very different. Right? So you can enjoy this whole transition of going from juvenile to male, females and males. So this is the bipartite wrasse. On the left is the female. I got 3 females. I put them in there. They were really teeny tiny, small. Okay. As they grew, one of them turned into a male. Okay. Again, if you try to mix the species of these leopard wrasses, they'll generally be okay until you have males. All right. So I used to have the black leopard wrasse. And I had these. They males, and once this one turned into a male, it killed the other male and the other females. So even in a 500-gallon tank, right, you find these issues. It's not big enough, right? But you can easily keep a trio of these in a 75-gallon tank. Okay. So some of these wrasses like to sleep in the sand. So if you have a bare bottom tank, these wrasses are not a good choice. Okay? Because they like to bury in the sand and sleep. They're not going to be comfortable without it. I've seen people keep it without the sand, but they don't feel comfortable. Same thing, you can see this juvenile to adult transition. Right? This is a fairly rare fish. It's a Lenardi's wrasse. Right? I got these as juveniles. The one blackish looking one, that's what they look like when they are babies. Okay? And they transition into a beautiful looking female. Okay? I had this female for several years, and then it transitioned into a male. And so the one on the picture on the top left-hand corner there, that's what the male looks like. Right? As far as I know, this is the first Lenardi wrasse that has transitioned from a juvenile all the way to a male in anybody's aquarium at home. Okay? So these are not very common fish, but I was lucky to get them and keep them. Very touchy fish in the beginning, but once they settle in, this fish was indestructible. All right? Unfortunately, again, for me, this fish got to about 8 inches. The male was 8 inches. And he wants to live in the sand at night. And every night, you'd kick up that sand, right? Bury all the corals around it, right? And it also has a bad habit because it's always scrounging for food. It's always picking up crustaceans. It used to eat bristleworms. It'll pick up the sand in his mouth and start swimming around and just release the sand in my tank, right? Now when you have SPS corals in your tank, they can't shed off the sand easily. So when you have corals that are 15, 20 inches big, and this fish is dropping sand in the middle of these corals, eventually the coral starts to die in the middle. So I would have these patches of death in the tank because the fish was being destructive. Right? And not unexpected, I didn't expect that kind of behavior from a wrasse. Right? I've seen that with some of the tangs, they'll do it. Okay? And with the big tank, I can't go in every day and brush off all the corals. Right? Other wrasses is the Cerabilis species. These are the small fairy wrasses. These are spectacular fish to keep, and everybody loves the super males. Okay? But like I said, I'd much rather get the females and start them off young and have them turn into a super male in my tank. Right? Some examples of other flasher wrasses. As you can see in the bottom left, that's the McCosker's wrasse. When it starts to flash, the colors are just incredible. Okay? Cheap fish too, they're not that expensive, right? But they have this bad habit. This is how I found one of my wrasses. I have a net on top of my tank, right? And he was still sitting on top, right? So they are master escape artists, right? Once in a while, when I'm cleaning my tank, I'll open the tank up, remove the net, right? Feed the fish, go do something else, and come back and find this fish flopping on the floor. They'll jump out. You know? Another great fish, hawkfish. Again, I have a pair of the flame hawks in my tank. Another long-lived fish. I mean, I've had these pair for at least 12 to 14 years. Right? The long-nosed hawkfish, same thing. They're easy to pair up. If you have a big one, get a small one, and chances are the small one will stay the female. Right? Same thing with a lot of these fish. Okay? If you want to pair them up, get one big and one small one. Right? Dragonets, great fish. Okay? Beautiful to look at. You can keep them in pairs. Okay? On the right-hand side is the scooter blenny, and that's a spawning pair of scooter blennies in my tank, right? So you can come in at night, see them spawn every night, okay? In a big tank, you don't have to worry about food for them because there's so much that they can keep picking on, right? Assessors, another beautiful yellow fish, very bright, aquacultured. ORA raises these fish. Okay. They're kind of neat. They like to swim in caves and they swim upside down most of the time. Right? The problem with this fish, you don't see it that. I have 4 assessors. I've never seen 4 at simultaneously. Okay. But like I said, I love these fish. And of course, there's the clownfish. Who doesn't love clownfish, right? But I stay away from the bigger species of clownfish. Maroon clownfish, the Clarkies, and that whole complex of Clarkies, because those get big, and they get mean when they get big. Okay, I prefer the Perculas and the Ocellaris and the hybrids of those fish. And the good thing is they're all being tank raised. I don't have to get them from the wild. Okay, and the cool thing is, you get 2 clownfish, one of them will turn into a male, one will be a female. And the clownfish is the one of the fish where the male will turn into a female. Okay? So if you lose one of them, if you lose the smaller one, you just wait, let it grow big, it's going to turn into a female, then get another small one, and you can pair them up. Right? The other nice thing about clownfish is that they will lay eggs in your aquarium. They'll spawn. Right? And they spawn on a substrate. They lay their eggs on a substrate. So you actually have a chance of raising those fish, right? So there's a whole bunch of clownfish that I raised over the years. Have fun with them. You can keep several of these. They might squabble, but you can easily keep several of these. Right? And then there's these fish these are not mine, okay? I can't even afford these fish without losing my wife. Okay. So that's the clarion angel. Beautiful fish. One on the left was mine. I got one. When they were first coming in, they were cheap, relatively cheap. Okay. That's the juvenile coloration on it. That's the color when it turns into a larger fish. And that's another destructive fish in a reef. Okay. It'll destroy a lot of things. And a mean fish too. Some others that are out of my league, but I know friends who have them, right? So on the left is the Personatus, or the masked angel. It's in the same family as the other Genicanthus I talked about. So the males and females look very different. The males, this is the juvenile, female coloration, right? And then on the right, and the males will have yellow face. Okay. And on the right is the ultimate fish that most people would love to have, right? The peppermint angel. Right? The last I heard, when they came into the market, they were selling for somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000 a piece. Okay, so if you have a lot of money, use some great fish. The problem with peppermint angels is they don't live long at all. I don't know anybody in captivity who's kept them for a long time, except maybe one guy in Japan. He's had it for a long time. Okay. They live really deep, they're hard to collect, and so on and so forth. So there's a reason why they're expensive too. Right? So some of the other tips that I would love to share with you with fish. I've been keeping fish for 35 years now, almost, right? Quarantine. Doesn't matter what you do. Quarantine your fish before you put them in the aquarium. All right? I have 60 fish. If I put a diseased fish in there and it knocks out half my fish, that's a huge loss. Okay? So be very diligent about putting a fish into a tank where you already have fish in there. You already invested a lot in those fish you have in there. So quarantine them. Even if I buy them from a place that quarantines them, I don't put them in my tank right away. Right? I put them in a separate tank. I'll watch them. I'll see how they behave. I'll wait sometimes a couple of months, right, before I put them in my big tank. I get them eating the foods that I feed, so they're comfortable with that. I fatten them up. And I always joke, I said, I'm fattening them up to take a beating. Okay? Because they have to survive that beating. They're going to get a beating when they go in my big tank. Right? Somehow fish know there's a new fish in there. They just know. Okay? And they all gang up and attack that poor little fish. So strengthen it. get it to the point where it can take some of the beating, right? And chances are it'll survive, right? So if you don't want to set up a quarantine tank yourself, find a vendor or supplier who actually quarantines the fish, okay? And not just says they quarantine it for 3 days or 5 days. That's not enough, all right? It's got to be properly quarantined, okay? You want to keep the fish healthy and spawning, you have to feed them well, okay? They have to be fat and healthy. You can't have skinny fish. They're not going to spawn. They're not going to be happy, right? So that means you have to feed them a lot. Feed them a lot of different foods. And what I like to do is get my fish to the point where they start eating pellets, okay? Because then I can travel. I put an automatic feeder, and I can still feed the fish, and they'll be fed, all right? So every time I feed my fish with frozen food, I always throw pellets in there, right? So they get used to the pellets, right? And then I just throw pellets once in a while so they know it's food and they get used to it. And even fish you think wouldn't eat pellets, you'll find that they'll eat them. My marginalis butterfly would eat pellets. Okay? So there's a little bit of training that you may have to do to get your fish to eat pellets. And I feel very happy once I get the fish eating pellets. Okay? Screen your tanks, you know. Wrasses will jump for sure, okay? Hawkfish will jump, all right? Pygmy angels don't generally jump that much, all right? My hippo tank jumped out. Who would think a hippo tank will jump out of the water, you know? And I have this great story with this little hippo tank of mine. I came back from work. I always go, first thing I do, I come back from work, I look at my tank. Looking, I couldn't see the hippo tank. So I'm looking around, see it on the floor. Pick it up, stiff as a board. Absolutely stiff. I'm like, fish is dead, you know. So I usually dump my fish in the toilet and I flush them. I give them their funeral. Right? So I take this fish, I throw it in the toilet bowl. I don't know what, I thought I saw a gill move. So I reached into my toilet bowl, I grabbed it out of there, and I said, look, if you're going to die, die in my tank at least, you know? So I threw him back in my tank. He tumbled around, got sucked into the intake of the pump. I peeled him off of there, all the marks from the strainer. Floated around and disappeared. I said, he's gone against into the rock somewhere and he's dead. You know, starfish are going to eat him and there'll be no fish left, right? A week later, I'm feeding my tank and I see this fish come out. It's not even blue anymore. It's got no fins left, but it's trying to eat food. I'm looking at it, that was my blue tang, you know? And he recovered, and you look at him now, he's 16 years old, perfectly fine. That's the miracle story, you know? So, fish will jump, okay? When you least expect it. And the other thing I like to, I've learned through accidents, I hate sea cucumbers anymore. I always keep tanks with sand, and I would put a few sea cucumbers to keep my sand clean, right? I always check on my tanks at night before I go to bed to make sure things are okay. So my 75-gallon tank had 2 black sea cucumbers in it that I've had for a long time, and they were. Came back the next day morning, and all my fish were just laying on the floor gasping. All of them, right? What happened here? They were perfectly fine the night before. So I quickly grabbed whatever I could that I thought was still alive and grasping, and I threw them into a bucket of fresh water. I mean, not fresh water, but fresh salt water, right? And they started to recover. A few of them died, but several of them recovered. So I'm like, why would a fish do that? Something's poisoned my tank. Right? So I'm starting to look around, and I find this black sea cucumber wrapped around the intake of my pump, shredded, okay? All his guts are spewing out, and that's where it was. That sea cucumber killed, or almost killed, most of my fish, all right? So these are accidents waiting to happen. I've had sea cucumbers for years and years and years, and nothing's ever happened. But at one time, it happened. I lost really some beautiful fish. I lost my joculators, which is one of my most favorite fish. Can't get them anymore. Okay. So, all right. So that's my fish story. And I'll take any questions you might have. Right. Thanks. Anybody have questions? Okay. Yes. I don't feed them anything in particular. I make my own fish food. Right? I go to Walmart. I buy frozen scallops. I'll buy frozen fish, frozen mahi, frozen cod, okay, squid. I get them home. They're frozen. I run them through a salad shooter while they're frozen. Works great. Just chop them up into small bits. Now I'll mix it up with other smaller foods and stuff, and I freeze it. And that's what I feed as frozen food, and then I have pellet foods. So, I just dump the food in the tank, and it spreads out like you saw in the video, and other fish can get to it, right? I always feed in 2 different places usually. That way, some of the other fish who are a little shy have a chance at getting to it. So yeah, the mandarins, I've had them for a long time. They find something to eat. They're happy. Again, that's another cool fish that I got them tank raised, aquacultured from biota. So they were good. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about quarantining, lessons you've learned, size of tank, any things like that?
So a little bit more about quarantine. Everybody should have a quarantine tank, okay? And I usually like to keep my quarantine tank running all the time, right? So it's not like I'm setting it fresh, right? So I always have a filter in there. I'll always be running with the water. That way the bacteria is always in there, right? The size of the tank depends on the size of the fish and the type of fish you're going to quarantine. Small fish, 10-gallon tank is usually good enough, right? Give the fish a lot of places to hide, right? I use PVC pipes at the bottom. I use a lot of PVC pipe. I just throw it in there. Elbows and, tees, so the fish have a place to hide, okay? And then whatever medication you're going to do based on what the fish might need, okay? Then you go through the medicine protocols, right? I don't like to use copper, so I try to avoid it as much as I can. But flukes and prazi, things like that, those work. So, yeah, and it's one of those things that, make sure the fish is. I'm happy keeping it there for 3 months in a separate tank before it goes into my big tank, right? Because a fish, if it's not going to eat your food, it takes them a while to get used to the food. Right? Just throw it in a big tank with a lot of aggressive fish around, it's not going to survive. Okay? So, fatten them up before you throw them in. And again, like I said, I like to start from a source which I know is a good source for fish, right? That quarantines their fish. Okay? And even then, I don't throw it in my tank right away. There's only so much you can trust their quarantine, right? But the likelihood is better when you used to come from Live Aquarium, when I used to buy when Kevin Cohen was there, right? I knew the fish were going to come in. They were going to come in healthy. They were already eating. He had quarantined them. But I still would sometimes say, hey, if I put it in there now and it kills 60 of my fish, that's a big loss, right? So Any other questions? I'll be around if you want to talk to me afterward. There's another talk going to start now, and I don't want to run over too late. I'm stopping at 2 o'clock.